When you get through to the second stage of the agency interview process, it's more than likely that you'll be asked to respond to a brief or to present back on a task that you've been given. Now, this can seem really daunting and is often laced with a little bit of anxiety. You've got to present to strangers.
How do you even write a good presentation? How do you even know what to write? How do you know if you've got it completely wrong? What do they even want to see?
These are all good questions that often arrive in the shape of floating grey anxiety demons for me. But don't worry, because in this video I'm going to show you what kind of tasks that you might be given at this stage of the interview process, how to approach them, and how to make sure that you nail the presentation on the day. Welcome to Media Impostor. My name's Jack and I'm here to help you make sense of advertising, creativity and careers. This is the second video in the Impostor interview guide. And today we're focusing on the response to brief in the second stage interview. Now this stage is often a little bit more tricky than the first stage interview because you've actually got to prepare some work for it. And whilst that does seem a little bit daunting, it's actually your chance to really shine. So let's start by having a look at what sort of tasks you might be given. This depends largely on the level of position that you're going for. So for an entry-level role, you might simply be asked to present back about a couple of campaigns that you liked and disliked and why you liked or disliked them. For an exec or senior exec role, you might be asked to talk about a specific competitor within a brand's category. And then for an account manager level position, you might be looking at something a little bit more detailed and most likely responding to a full brief where you actually put together a media plan to support your idea. The fundamentals of all of this remain the same, however, because ultimately when you present back, it's going to rely on your actual ability to present, the way that you've structured your presentation, the research that's gone into it, and how you set it up. So let's start out with the obvious. When you've been given the task or the brief, read it through and then read it again, and definitely read it again after that as well, because chances are you read it too quickly the first two times and you will have missed stuff because naturally you're excited to get through it. Get a pen and annotate the key elements of what's required. And then as you're going through it, try and work out the bits of information that aren't included within the brief that you think might actually be useful. This process is going to stop you from gallivanting off and working really hard to produce the wrong answer. Once you have an idea of all the things that you'd like to know that aren't included within the brief, you can turn it into a list of questions for the hiring manager. So you need to do this within the first day of getting the brief. You can then put the questions to the hiring manager, who should have made themselves open to receiving questions. Now, when I give these sorts of tasks, I actually want to have questions back. This is almost part of the interview itself because it shows that the person who has received the brief or the task is actually engaging with it and really thinking about it. So you can already make yourself look good before you interview by asking these questions. Another piece of information that's really important that you get is how long they want you to present for and in what format. Most likely this is going to be PowerPoint slides. If you were asked to present for half an hour, then you're probably not going to want to have more than a slide a minute at most. So when you think about title slides and divider slides and all that sort of thing, then you're probably going to want about 35 slides to 40 slides max. Once you've got the presentation written, you're going to want to time yourself to make sure that you're not massively under or overshooting. So let's focus on the example of being asked to come up with a big idea for a campaign and then a media plan to promote it. It's probably really tempting just to structure your presentation just like that. Your idea and then how you're going to promote it. Hit them with the idea at the start and then just talk about the promotion. Bob's your uncle. But I'm afraid Bob isn't your uncle just yet. Structuring your presentation so that your ideas are bulletproof and conveyed in an interesting and engaging way is really bloody hard. I want you to think about joke structure. Well, think about where the punchline comes in a joke. It doesn't come straight in at the start, otherwise it wouldn't have any impact. It comes after a period of setting everything up and building it up so that the punchline makes sense within the context of the joke. Your big idea and how you're going to promote it through media is almost the punchline in a joke. You've got to spend time setting it up so that when you're questioned about it, you've already built up all of your rationale for why you're actually going to have that as your solution. The idea is that you draw your audience in and you prime them so that your idea almost seems inevitable. Think about how great stories work. They work because a character is overcoming different obstacles that they face by making choices that lead to logical consequences. Think about the first few seasons of Game of Thrones. They were brilliant because they had this thread of logic running all the way through, and it's also the reason that season 8 was kind of widely received as being crap, because that kind of logical sequence of cause and effect had disappeared. And when that logical progression is broken, it jars our brains. Now, I'm not telling you that you've got to go and write Game of Thrones for your response to brief, but What you do need to make sure is that your presentation follows those logical cause and effect steps. Show your workings in a logical way that leads to your idea. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how to research, but 4 areas that you should be looking into if you're responding to a brief would be to start by looking at the brand itself, try and understand everything that you can about the brand, and see if there are any nuggets or insights that you might be able to hang a campaign idea on. The next is to look at the category. So who does this brand compete with? How are the other brands behaving within the category? And how does your brand sit within that? The third is to look at who you're targeting and why. So working out who the target audience are. They may have given you this within the brief, but sometimes it can be good to challenge this. But make sure if you do, that you've got some really solid reasoning for doing so. And finally, look at any appropriate cultural trends that are happening in the wider world that could be drawn in to be a part of this idea. Ultimately, what you're doing is putting together a coherent argument for your ideas. So what you want to do is, once you've done your research and you've actually come up with your idea, etc., and I'm not going to tell you how to do that because you're in the second stage of the interview, so you're smart enough to do this. What you need to do is write down your argument line by line, just bullet point it out. These will then become the titles for each of your slides. So if you're planning to write 30 slides, write out 30 bullet points. These should read coherently. This will also mean that when you're presenting a fact or an observation, or if you've got one, an insight, then it's going to make sense. When you're going to present an observation, a fact, or even an insight, you need to be asking yourself the question, so what? Just by asking this, you can ensure that your argument flows and that it's not just a case of, yeah, this, and it doesn't lead anywhere. Another little structural trick that I like to use that plays to the storytelling brain is to tell them what you're going to tell them without actually telling them what you're going to tell them. This basically means open by creating a little bit of intrigue. People like to know what they can expect from something. So I like to use a slide that's often titled 5 things I'm going to talk about today. And I take the 5 key points from the presentation and I obscure them a little bit. I turn them perhaps into questions, and that means that you can gain the intrigue of the person that you're going to present to. Finally, I'm going to cover a little bit about the actual delivery of the presentation. Now, for loads of people, this is really, really tough, but it is actually a skill that you can learn and develop. It's not just some God-given thing that some people are hit with and some people aren't. Believe me, all of this only works because I cut out the infinite amount of errors that I make every single time. For a 10-minute video, I often got about 35 minutes of footage that I cut down. Presenting is a really hard art to master, especially when it's to a room full of people, but it's a really important skill. And there are some really easy ways to stop yourself from looking like an amateur. The first port of call is to record yourself presenting the presentation. Just prop your camera phone up against your camera phone. Pop your mobile. See, look, now I'm not editing it. Just prop your phone up against some books and sit at a desk and present it back. You're going to be presenting while sat down most likely, and only to 1 or 2 other people. So this is the best way to record yourself. You can catch all of the errors that you would make and notice any sort of weird things you do. Do you scratch your beard constantly whilst you talk, like I tend to? Or do you find yourself nervously looking at the ground? Do you wave your hands up like this every now and again? All these things that you might want to iron out, you can identify and then change. My next piece of advice when it comes to doing this is not to just read the slides out. This is something that everyone does when they're a little bit nervous. They just read the title out and then they read every single little bit of text that's on the slides. There's a really easy way around this. If you find yourself writing a big block of text on a slide, then you can put that in the notes and use that as your voiceover. You can reduce what you were going to say to a few bullet points and then maybe an image, or even better, just an image. And then finally, make eye contact with the people who you're presenting with. Smile and be enthusiastic. It can also help to start out talking about what you enjoyed about the task. Show that you enjoyed the task, because if you didn't enjoy the task, then you might not be going for the right job. In the next video in the Impostor interview guide, I'm going to be looking specifically at the mistakes that people make and how you can avoid making them so that you don't come across in the wrong way during your interviews. If you've come this far, then please do subscribe and become one of the imposters today. Thanks for watching. We've got this.